Den himmelske lovsang har ikke røykt og nemmer livlig og sovren en klang. En av jordisk musik skjult vårt hjerte seg frie når skogen og dalen gjenlyder og sång.
At Augsburg College, we believe we are called to serve our neighbor. It's our bold vision for the 21st century, but it's a vision that has come up and out of our history as a college. And this vision, which we claim is very real and concrete in our daily life, is also a vision that we find illustrated throughout the history of the college.
Augsburg was the first seminary founded by Norwegian Lutherans in America. Augsburg opened in September 1869 in Marshall, Wisconsin, and later moved to Minneapolis in 1872. August Venus was Augsburg's first president. Professor Venus recruited two teachers from Norway, Sven Oftedal and Georg Sverdrup. These three men clearly articulate the direction of Augsburg: to educate Norwegian Lutherans to minister to immigrants and to provide such college studies that would prepare students for theological study. In 1874, they proposed a three-part plan. First, train ministerial candidates. Second, prepare future theological students. And third, educate the farmer, worker, and businessman. The statement stressed that a good education is also practical. This commitment to serve the neighbor has its roots in Norway. It's about paying attention to the world around you and being ready to serve that reality.
I think a good way to get into it is to talk about the similarities that we see in the tradition that they brought in the 1860s and what we have today. And for me, the major similarity has to do with place and with purpose in a particular place.
When Minneapolis really starts to take off is after the Civil War. And many of the leaders understood that there would be a huge influx of Scandinavians. And one of the mayors understood, one of the leaders in town understood that it would be good to have a school here. And so he began to talk with Ole Paulsen, who's considered the grandfather of Augsburg. And Ole Paulsen began pushing for the land in Cedar-Riverside to become a place for this college that was now in Marshall, just starting at Marshall, Wisconsin. Leaders did know that here was going to be the center of Scandinavian life and culture, so they wanted to have this Scandinavian college here. That made the Cedar-Riverside Avenue what was once called Snus Boulevard, a very active and culturally significant place.
Before the founding of Augsburg Seminary and College, there was the reality of life in Norway. The founders of Augsburg were shaped by their experience there.
But when they came here from Norway, they came seeking freedom and seeking a place to establish the free church. Now, most of the people who were involved in the founding of Augsburg College were people who had been involved in those movements in Norway.
The awakening in Norway first came with the work of Hans Nielsen Hauge, who was a lay evangelist who had an experience in 1796 while he was plowing the fields. He had this experience that absolutely, utterly changed him. He said, once after that, I felt as though I was in communion with God. I felt as though God had forgiven me my sins. I wanted to be with Him forever, and I wanted to serve my neighbor. And as America started to open up, then they came over with that notion of work and salvation. And after the Civil War, then many more started to come over, and they were affected now by the university's version of the Haugean movement called the Johnsonian revival. And that was by a man named Johnson who taught at the University of Oslo, and he took Haugeanism and made it available to the intellectuals because it had not been an intellectual movement at the time. And Sverdrup and Oftedal were at school in Oslo when he was doing this.
Georg Sverdrup was very much aware of these freedom currents, you might call them, in the mid-19th century in Norway. And they were parallel with Norway's entire struggle to become autonomous and get away from Sweden.
The notion of freedom was at the heart of the struggle, both in the church and in the political world. The early leaders of Augsburg were active in that struggle.
Georg's grandfather's brother, the first Georg in our history of the Georg Sverdrups, was actually one of the men who was sent to Eidsvoll as a representative to write the Constitution in 1814. And so he had a role in shaping what would become the future Norway.
Sverdrup and Oftedal, when they came here, they were very much influenced by that notion of the lay people should have a voice in the church, and they should be freed to work in their various vocations, which at the time was mostly farming.
They came here as very, very poor people, not the Sverdrups. They were educated, they were part of the elite, but they came to work with the immigrants who came from nothing and no educational background. So when Georg Sverdrup came to Augsburg, one of his principles was that we want to lift up this student who's had no opportunity before and make sure that they get a really strong grounding. So this was an opportunity to bring democracy into education and into the clergy. And it's an opportunity that he really relished. Georg Sverdrup has got wonderful language around, okay, we're now in the new country, we're here to form the free church in the United States of America.
The Scandinavians who came to America formed the United Church. But in some ways, the name United was overstated.
The background of Augsburg, of course, was broader than in the 1880s and so on, and they belonged to the conference, you know, Norwegians and Danes.
And at that time, Augsburg was in the middle of its big fight about which school should be the school that produced pastors in this country.
And that's when it got really bitter, because there was a struggle to determine which would be the college of the United Church. St. Olaf School had been established in 1874, I believe, so it was around and wanted to be that school. Of course, there was no question that Augsburg Seminary would be the seminary of the United Church, but which would be the college?
So during this upheaval, while Augsburg was trying to find its place, in 1893 they left the United Church and became what they call the Friends of Augsburg.
So actually Augsburg founded its own synod rather than the other way around.
And so then Sverdrup and Oftedal had to go around and get students who were committed to their understanding of producing pastors for this lay-centered church.
The founders of Augsburg were highly principled people, and the principle of freedom was foremost.
Sverdrup and Oftedal had come to this country with a dream of creating a Norwegian Lutheran church in America that was fit for the American set of ideals, and that was freedom. Freedom. That was one of their big words. And they didn't want a church that was dominated by the leadership of pastors, clerically heavy. And they wanted lay people to be free. So that was their big word. The social consciousness of Augsburg comes because it has this pietistic background. And that's hard for people to understand because that particular movement seems conservative in this country. But in Europe, the pietists are the liberals. That's what the Sverdrups were. They were the liberals.
Those early Norwegian immigrants were poor, struggling hard to get on their feet, trying to build a new life. Many settled in the Cedar-Riverside neighborhood.
That kind of immigrant sensibility is not apparent to us anymore in the Norwegian community, but it's very apparent in the new immigrants that we see throughout the Cedar-Riverside neighborhood. You know, they call this Little Ellis Island, and I think that's very apt because after the Danes and the Germans and the Czechs, Bohemians moved on, now we get the new wave, and we've got Latinos, and we've got the Somalis, and so it's still very much a place where people come to start over.
Augsburg has been shaped by its location as well as contributing to the shape of its location.
And I think that this concept of education for service, that is a motto that has been long used for the college, is really lived out because of where we're located.
So that's why I say I think one of the major ways in which we see the link to the past is in place and purpose in a particular place. We're still doing that with the Augsburg vision, still working with the neighborhood, still trying to understand how our special role can be played here in the Cedar-Riverside neighborhood.
What did it mean for the college to be a part of that community and the gateway It's such a pleasure now, because I'm pretty active in the Cedar-Riverside neighborhood, to go to meetings in which people can't say enough positively about the way Augsburg oriented that building toward the community.
Many people believe that personal piety and intellectual pursuit are at odds, but not so with these people.
I think that academic rigor is, in Augsburg's history, directly linked to the sense that we need to be the best we can be, because we are providing this education for people who wouldn't get it otherwise. We've got to do it right, and we've got to do it true to our initial mission as a seminary.
This is a place where the mind is going to be stretched and people are going to be prepared, because it was that thought of entering into society. First, it was a kind of a preacher school, you know, to prepare. So preachers were qualified to go in and hold their own academically. But then later, then it was this, we also have to train the best scientists and the best doctors possible to enter into society.
The tradition itself was deeply imbued with Bernard Christensen's wisdom that the Christian faith liberates minds and lives.
I think it's still important. You have to think about what the world is like and about your place in it.
This faith was an experienced faith, personal but not private.
They were evangelical, but they were not fundamentalists.
The emphasis was on faith as something you experienced, God as someone you knew.
A deep conviction about the centrality of the gospel of Jesus Christ. No compromise on that. But then a confidence that that had a rugged task that it set us to in the world, that it wasn't to be also nervous and protective.
What I marvel at is the considered risks that Joel Torstenson, that Bernard Christensen, that the Bataldens, who embody that kind of tradition, just reached out to the world and the community and offered their best thinking as well as their best service.
The strong connection between faith and learning, and our belief that you actually can't separate those two things, and I think you'll find that also to be a very real part both of our history and of how we teach students today.
So when Augsburg says now we believe we are called to serve our neighbor, it goes deep in the tradition. It is consistent with a sense of Christian vocation and engagement with the world that Christ loves.
It's finally about, what do you know that's useful? What do you know and can do that helps our society be a better place, a more fair place, a more just place?
The fact that we live in the most diverse zip code between Chicago and Los Angeles gives us wonderful opportunities every day to know our neighbor right in our own neighborhood. But it also is an illustration that we believe that our neighbors live throughout the world. And in fact, Augsburg's connections through its Center for Global Education to Namibia, to Mexico, and to Latin America give us daily reminders that our neighbors are not just here, but they are all around us. And we take that vision very seriously. We believe we are called to serve our neighbor.
Joel Torstenson, farm boy, grew up in western Minnesota, ran farmer co-ops, understood the call of the college, and I think it harkens back to the Free Church. It's all about community.
They built all these institutions that we couldn't possibly support today. You have the hospitals, you have the Ebenezer Home Society, Lingblomston, just here in this area, Fairview, the Deaconess Hospital, Lutheran Social Service. I mean, all of those things, they just built as a matter of course. That's what you do for your neighbor.
I think that it comes to expression again in certain people. I think of Karl Christlock. Under his teaching, a number of people became engaged in the political process. I think of Martin Sabo. Martin Sabo was a student of Karl Christlock.
Really, all of our education, both in the classroom, outside the classroom, on campus, out in the community, is about helping our students to discern and understand the calls they have to life in the world.
The understanding of education for service means that education needs to be accessible.
When we talk about access today to populations that have been traditionally underserved and underrepresented in the academy, we're not talking about something that's very different from what we saw in a century ago in this access for farmers and sailors, and maybe for recovering alcoholics who came from Norway, where there was a lot of hard drinking because it was hard times. And they came and they reformed and they went to college. But you know, our programs today, for example, Step Up, which is for students who are recovering from chemical dependency, or the Class Office, the programs for students who have learning and other emotional disabilities. These are populations that we really want to serve.
Why don't you tell my friends I'm coming too?
When it was a real moment for me when they hired me and said, you know, help us integrate the college. And so it became my job with a couple of other people to really work at this.
Access to higher education has been a hallmark of Augsburg from the beginning, and was demonstrated by the admission of women in 1921, and now even more evident in the support programs for students of diverse cultures.
First generation, we have 2 federal grants from the TRIO program in Washington that allows us to encourage students who otherwise would not come to college to be part of our student community. So I think that goes directly back to the concept of access that Augsburg had in its founding years.
To my knowledge, I think Augsburg was the first in this area, delivered college degrees in prisons.
Keeping in mind the primary mission of the school, the leaders of Augsburg were faithful stewards of this legacy right up through the modern era.
Of course, Bernard Christensen, who served this college so faithfully and well from 1938 to the early 1960s. He was then followed by Oscar Anderson, who did a wonderful job, I think, in linking Augsburg to the city in much more kind of concrete ways during a very rough time in the cities in the 60s and 70s and into the early 80s. He was followed by Charles Anderson, who of course was a wonderful Reformation historian and got a wonderful leader who had come from the seminary and came to this college at a particular moment in its history where it needed someone both to bring a sense of creativity and kind of a sense of joy over this place, but also to bring some discipline to that work. And I think that he did a wonderful job during his term as president in doing that. And then my immediate predecessor, William Frame, who came here in 1997, and for his 9 years just did a wonderful job both of shaping the vision for this institution and bringing voice to it in a way that I think is very much a gift to me, but also helping to take all of the kind of wonderful trajectory of this college in enrollment, in its finances, in its facilities, and helping to bring some shape to those. And so I inherit this wonderful gift of Augsburg College at a point in its history where many of the ways have been prepared for us, and we now have this foundation upon which we build for the future.
The culture of Augsburg was infused with a sense of freedom, service, and egalitarianism. This has been characterized by a democratic administrative style and a dialogical approach to teaching.
I have experienced really a laboratory that was open for us to try different things.
For me as a teacher and in the faculty development work that I've done here for years, it's just so important to see the democratic impulse in the college, the sense of serving the student that you get in front of you, and the commitment to high-quality education, because you owe it to these people to give them the best start that you can.
The college has had mottos at different points in its life that have really stood for important commitments that it have. If you go back to the original seal of this college, written in Norwegian on that seal around a picture of Martin Luther, is in fact John 1:14.
Ordet ble kjøtt. The Word became flesh. And there the focus is really on the Word, and it's on the living Word in the person of Jesus Christ.
And what a wonderful reminder that every day this college is seeking to make the Word flesh here in our lives on this campus and in the neighborhood and in the world. Another important motto for this college, of course, was education for service, which we continue to use in so many ways, trying to think about how the education we provide here prepares our students for lives of service and leadership in the world.
And then under George Sverdrup, we began to emphasize the motto, through truth to freedom.
Which is this wonderful statement that, again, in that deep and confident faith, the truth that we know leads us, frees us to be able to serve our neighbor, to be hospitable, to learn.
Christ has already died for us. We are already absolved of our sins. We are already free. That freedom is so vast that we at the same time are bound to serve our neighbor.
And then our recent one, which is a bit more whimsical, but perhaps puts a point on it, which is Augie is an action verb. How about that for the future-pointing motto for this institution? I think it really kind of gets to the point of what we're trying to do, prepare students who know that life is about living out their commitments.
Said I'm gonna let it shine.